Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. I'm Mr. Pumpkin, your host for tonight's stories. Tonight, I'll be sharing 5 disturbing true deep woods horror stories, all based on real accounts. I think you'll find these both chilling and fascinating. If you enjoy the video, please take a moment to leave a like, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing that. And if you'd like to support the channel, consider subscribing. It truly helps a lot and allows me to keep bringing you new stories. Now, if you're ready, let's begin tonight's unsettling journey into the deep woods. I used to work as a wildlife researcher for a small environmental organization in Montana. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved the solitude. I was stationed out near a place called Timberline Creek. The forest there is dense and silent. That summer, my assignment was to monitor moose activity and document migration behavior near the upper ridgelines. I was alone most of the time, living in a small field cabin our organization had built years ago. It wasn't much more than a single-room wooden box with a cot, propane stove, and a radio. I had a truck parked a few miles away, but I preferred to hike most of my routes. It felt natural and peaceful. The first few weeks passed quietly. The forest was full of its usual signs of life: deer trails, fox dens, the occasional black bear passing through. Nights were calm, though the air got bitterly cold after sunset. I'd often stay up late taking notes, listening to the creek that ran about 100 yards from the cabin. It became white noise, something that lulled me to sleep. But around the 4th week, I began noticing something off about that creek. I'd hear it differently, not louder or quieter, but interrupted, as if something large would step into the water and stop there for long stretches. I'd sometimes go out with my flashlight to check, expecting a moose, but there'd be nothing. The next morning, I'd always find faint impressions near the bank. Not hooves, not paws, just deep, oblong impressions that looked too long for any animal I knew. At first, I wrote it off as soil shifts from the current, but the impressions became more defined, like footprints, only bare and oddly flat. They showed up on the opposite bank, sometimes in pairs, sometimes one at a time, as if something had crossed but never returned. A week later, while on one of my morning hikes, I noticed something strange about the forest's quiet. It wasn't just still, it was drained. The birds that normally fluttered near the brush were gone. The usual rustling of squirrels and wind through branches had stopped entirely. It felt like the air itself had thickened, like the woods were waiting for something to pass. I tried shaking it off, thinking maybe a predator was nearby, but the sense of being watched clung to me like humidity. That evening, as I was filling out my notes, I noticed movement at the edge of the tree line across the creek. It was subtle at first, just a shape between trunks, barely visible against the fading light. It didn't move like a bear or moose. It was too upright, too still. I stared at it for nearly a minute before realizing it wasn't moving at all. I almost convinced myself it was a shadow until the moon rose behind it, and I saw a faint outline, something tall, narrow, and leaning slightly forward, as if observing. I stayed inside that night, telling myself it was exhaustion. I'd been working long hours, barely eating right, barely sleeping. The human mind plays tricks when it's alone too long, I reminded myself. But I couldn't shake the memory of that outline. Over the next few days, I noticed smaller signs. My equipment would be shifted when I returned from my routes. My camp stove, which I kept outside, had been moved 2 feet closer to the cabin wall. I'd hear heavy rustling behind me while hiking, only for it to stop the second I turned around. The feeling of being followed was constant, though I never actually saw anyone. Around the 7th week, my radio started failing more often. The signal became warped, fuzzy, as if something was interfering. One night, I tried to call base, but couldn't get through. I left the radio on static, just for background noise. Anything to fill the silence. That's when I began hearing faint rhythmic taps under the static, like soft knocks or a slow pulse that came and went at irregular intervals. It became a routine. The noise, the footsteps, the shape beyond the trees. I'd wake up to find the ground disturbed outside, sometimes near the creek, sometimes right by my door. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal, but part of me knew that no animal walks upright and stops exactly at the doorframe without leaving claw or paw marks. One night, I woke up to what I first thought was wind against the cabin wall, but it wasn't wind. It was scraping, slow, deliberate, as though something was dragging a branch or maybe fingers across the wood. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, circling it once, then stopping right behind my cot. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. It stayed there for nearly 10 minutes. Then it was gone. The next morning, I packed to leave. I was supposed to stay another week, but I'd reached my limit. I started hiking toward where I'd parked my truck. It was a long, steep trail, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. That sense of being watched was unbearable. Halfway there, I noticed something else. All along the narrow trail, there were marks in the dirt. Those same elongated impressions, each one fresh, each one pointing downhill, the same direction I was going. I never ran, but I didn't stop either. By the time I reached my truck, the sun had dipped low enough to stain the forest in red light. I loaded my gear in and drove without stopping. I didn't even bother reporting back to the cabin. When I got to town, I told my supervisor I finished early and needed a few days before writing the final report. I didn't mention what I'd seen. I told myself there was no proof, and even if there was, who would believe it? About a month later, one of our new field researchers took over the same area. He lasted 4 days. When he came back, he looked pale, shaken, and refused to say much, only that he'd felt something out there that never let him out of sight. I used to be the kind of person who thought fear was something that could be conquered with logic. I worked as a land surveyor for over 10 years, spending much of that time deep in forests and mountain terrain across Colorado and Wyoming. I was comfortable being alone in the wilderness, sometimes for days. I knew how to track weather shifts, how to read land slope, how to tell what animals were nearby by the smell of the air. That confidence was the reason I accepted the Ridge Hollow job. I was contracted with a 2-man team to spend 9 days in the area and map about 30 square miles of rough terrain. The other surveyor, Dan, had an emergency a few days before departure, so the company gave me the option to postpone or go solo. I chose to go alone. I'd done it before, and I preferred the silence of my own pace. The first 2 days were routine. The forest there was dense, untouched, full of dark pine stands that stretched up the mountainsides. I found old logging roads, rusted metal stakes, signs of earlier work decades before. I pitched my tent near a creek that cut through the valley and took readings along the ridgeline during daylight. Nights were cool, calm, filled with the steady rush of running water and the distant sound of owls. But on the 3rd day, I began finding things that didn't fit. Near the northern boundary, I found a section of ground that had been burned, a perfect circular patch, maybe 10 feet wide, where nothing grew. The trees surrounding it were fine, untouched, but the ground was scorched and cracked like an old fire pit. There were no ashes, no signs of a campfire, and no reason for that kind of isolated burn. I noted it and moved on, assuming maybe lightning had struck sometime in the past season. Later that afternoon, while taking slope readings along a ridge, I noticed how unusually quiet it was. No insects, no birds, not even wind through the branches. Just absolute stillness. When I stopped to take a drink, I felt a strange vibration under my boots. Not an earthquake or animal movement, but a faint rhythmic tremor, like a deep thudding miles beneath the surface. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. That night, I kept thinking about the burned circle and the vibration. I told myself I was just overanalyzing. I was alone, exhausted, and thinking too much. The mind fills silence with patterns when there's nothing else to hold on to. But the next morning, something felt wrong before I even unzipped the tent. I couldn't explain it. The forest just seemed off. The air was heavy. The light filtered strangely, almost dim despite a cloudless sky. When I walked to the creek to wash up, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Small stones arranged along the bank in uneven lines, like someone had placed them intentionally. They weren't there the night before. At first I assumed it was runoff, or maybe they had shifted with the current. But the pattern was too deliberate, almost like crude shapes, elongated ovals that resembled tracks, bare tracks. I decided to move camp further east. I told myself it was a safety decision. To get closer to the ridge, I needed to chart anyway. Deep down, though, I think I just didn't want to stay near that creek. By evening, I had reached a higher elevation, about a mile uphill. From that point, I could see most of Ridge Hollow, endless pines, a shadowed valley, and a faint glimmer of water running through it. It looked peaceful from a distance, but something about it felt wrong when I stared too long, as if the lines of the forest didn't match up correctly, as though the valley floor subtly shifted when I looked away. I tried to shake that feeling off, but it returned again that night. I woke sometime past midnight, unsure why, only to realize that everything around me was completely silent. No wind, no running water, not even the distant hum of insects. I lay there for minutes before realizing I could feel that same vibration again, that same deep, slow thudding from the ground, like a pulse from the earth itself. It was rhythmic, uneven, almost deliberate. I wanted to believe it was geological, maybe underground movement or a water shift, but I'd worked enough terrain to know it didn't feel like that. When morning came, I started packing. I'd only done 4 days of work, but I didn't care. I'd log what I had, fill in the rest later. Something about Ridge Hollow didn't feel natural, but the forest had other plans. As I began hiking back down, I realized my compass was spinning erratically. I checked my GPS, but it couldn't find signal. I thought maybe solar interference, but I noticed something worse. My footprints from the day before were gone. The trail I had cleared was buried under leaves that hadn't been there yesterday, as if the forest had rearranged itself overnight. I hiked in what I believed was the correct direction for hours, only to end up in the same hollow I'd passed earlier in the day. A shallow depression full of dead trees, their bark blackened like they'd been scorched long ago. The smell there was strange, metallic, faintly like rust and wet soil. The ground felt spongy underfoot, like stepping on layers of decomposing roots. It was while walking through that hollow that I found something I still can't explain. A set of survey markers, my own type of markers, metal stakes with red tags, driven neatly into the ground in a straight line. The problem was, I hadn't placed them. They were marked with the same paint I used, the same tape, but spaced perfectly across the burned patch, ending at a dead tree that had been hollowed out at the base. Inside that hollow trunk were animal bones, small, broken, arranged like a spiral. I stood there staring for a long time, my body tense, feeling the air around me shift again. The forest was silent, but I could sense something behind that silence, not sound, but presence. The feeling that something large and patient was just beyond the trees, aware of me, waiting. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the tree line. I didn't see movement, but the space between trunks seemed to bend, like the forest itself was breathing. The light dimmed though the sun was still high. I hiked fast, not caring about bearings anymore. The forest around me began to blur together, every ridge and tree looking identical. Hours passed before I finally found a landmark, the burned circle from earlier in the trip. I was certain I had been miles away from it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with my flashlight off, just listening. Every few minutes, I'd hear faint, irregular rustling, not from an animal, but like something large was moving with slow, deliberate weight between trees. Once or twice, I thought I saw faint movement in the darkness, something pale between the trunks, too tall and too thin to be a person. It moved silently, never coming closer, just pacing as if circling. By dawn, I decided to make a straight push toward where my truck was parked. I knew the general direction, even without GPS. I walked for nearly 5 hours through thick brush until the trees began thinning. I could finally see the slope that led back to the road. Relief hit me hard, but it was short-lived. As I started descending, I saw something lodged between two pines, one of my red survey tags. The problem was, it was tied around what looked like a section of fabric. I got closer and realized it was part of my own pack, the same kind I used to store field notes. My pack was intact on my shoulder. The fabric was torn, old, covered in moss, as though it had been there for years. My name was faintly visible on the tag. When I reached my truck, everything was covered in a thin layer of ash, though the sky was clear. The air smelled faintly of burnt wood. I drove straight back to the county road, not stopping until I reached the next town. I didn't file the full report. I submitted incomplete data and left Ridge Hollow off my future assignments list. 2 weeks later, a ranger from the Bureau of Land Management called to ask if I'd seen signs of a missing geological team that had gone into the same area earlier that year. They'd vanished without trace, their camp, tools, and vehicle all found, but no sign of them. I told him no. That night, out of some twisted sense of curiosity, I checked my archived field maps. Ridge Hollow wasn't listed anymore. The digital file still existed, but the coordinates opened to a blank zone. No contour lines, no elevation data, no trace of the forest at all. Just an empty grid labeled unavailable. I've been camping since I was a kid. My father used to take me out to the backcountry in Idaho every summer. We'd go so deep into the woods that you could walk all day without hearing another human voice. As I grew older, I kept that habit. The silence of the forest always helped me think. When I was in my late 20s, I started camping alone. People said it was reckless, but I felt safe in the woods. I'd always believed the forest was predictable if you respected it. That belief lasted until I found a forgotten camp at Black Pine Ridge. Black Pine Ridge isn't a marked location anymore. You won't find it on trail maps or park signage. Back in the 1980s, it used to be a designated forest recreation area, but a wildfire burned most of it down, and the state closed the trails. Over the years, vegetation grew back, but no one ever reopened it. The area remained unlisted and slowly fell into obscurity. It was mid-September when I decided to explore there. I had a week off from work and wanted somewhere quiet. The main forest access road was blocked by a rusted gate, but it wasn't hard to walk around it. The air was cool and dry, and everything smelled faintly like old pine resin and decayed bark. The first day was uneventful. I hiked along a stream that curved through the valley and found an old fire road half reclaimed by weeds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the steady flow of the stream. I set up camp on a small rise overlooking the water. That night, I sat by my small fire and listened to the woods. Every so often, I'd hear what sounded like distant branches snapping. Not unusual, probably deer or windfall. Still, the pattern was strange. It wasn't random. The sounds came at steady intervals, one after another, like footsteps stopping every few seconds. I tried not to focus on it, though the thought lingered long after I crawled into my tent. The next morning, the forest seemed unusually still. The stream had dropped to a slower trickle, and I noticed something odd. Along the opposite bank, there were remnants of man-made structures, pieces of foundation stone, metal fragments, and what looked like a collapsed chimney covered in moss. I realized it must have been part of the old campground. Curiosity pulled me closer. I crossed the stream and followed what was left of the trail. About a quarter-mile in, I found several old wooden posts sticking out of the ground, each one half-buried. A little farther ahead, I found the remains of 3 small concrete pads. They looked like where people once parked RVs or set up large tents. Grass and vines had taken over most of it, but you could still see faint scorch marks in places. As I moved deeper, the woods began to feel different. The canopy closed in tighter. The air felt thicker, and the forest floor turned oddly soft. It was quiet, even for the backcountry. I realized at some point that I hadn't seen or heard a bird since I'd crossed the stream. I followed what looked like an old service path leading uphill. That's when I saw the cabins. There were 4 of them, all in varying states of decay. The first was half collapsed, with its roof caved in. The second still had walls, but was leaning heavily. The third stood almost intact. I stopped at the 4th because it looked strange, newer somehow, like someone had tried to repair it years after the fire. The boards on its front wall were different from the others, mismatched and nailed roughly in place. I hesitated before stepping closer. The ground around the cabin was littered with debris, old cans, burned metal, shattered glass. But I also noticed things that didn't belong there. Modern food wrappers, a rusted propane canister, and a plastic jug half filled with murky water. Those items couldn't have survived since the 1980s fire. Someone had been there recently. The front door was slightly ajar. I didn't touch it, just peered through the gap. Inside was mostly dark, except for the faint light seeping through the roof. There were sleeping bags laid out, old and rotted. A camping stove sat on a crate, and against the back wall, I saw a strange shape, something piled high, covered in what looked like a large tarp. The smell was what made me back away. It wasn't rot exactly, but something stale, metallic, and sour, like damp metal mixed with ash. I left the cabin and returned to my camp by early afternoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that forest. Everything had gone so unnaturally quiet again. Even the stream seemed muffled. I started noticing small things around my camp that didn't make sense. My backpack slightly moved. The fire pit stone shifted. The small branch I'd used as a walking stick leaning against a different tree. I didn't sleep much that night. The woods seemed alive in a way I couldn't understand. Not loud or restless, but alert. It felt as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Sometime near dawn, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I noticed the smell. That same sour metallic odor I'd caught near the cabin. It was faint but undeniable, drifting into the tent through the small vent at the top. I froze. It felt like something was just outside the tent. I could sense movement, not direct sound, but a pressure against the air. When daylight came, I packed immediately. I didn't even eat breakfast. As I was taking down the tent, I noticed something etched into the soft soil beside where I'd slept. At first I thought it was an animal track, but it wasn't. It was a mark, 2 intersecting lines carved crudely into the ground, almost like an X made with a sharp stick. It was deliberate, placed exactly beside my tent flap. I hiked out fast. retracing my path to the stream. But when I got there, I froze. Across the water, along the opposite bank where I'd first seen the ruins, there were footprints, barefoot, deep into the mud, leading toward the forest I'd just left. They weren't mine. I moved fast after that, barely stopping to rest. The forest seemed to grow denser behind me, as if the trees were closing in. My GPS had stopped working, but I knew roughly where the access road should be. I followed the sun until I reached it by mid-afternoon. The air felt different once I was back on open ground, lighter, almost like I'd surfaced from underwater. When I reached my car, I sat there for a long time before starting it. My hands were shaking. It wasn't just fear, it was confusion. I couldn't understand what I'd experienced. That night, after I got home, I looked up old fire records for the Black Pine Ridge area. I found one small article from 1983 describing how a controlled burn had gotten out of hand and consumed a public campground. The official report listed one casualty, an unnamed maintenance worker who supposedly stayed behind after the evacuation to recover equipment. But there was a follow-up note from a park ranger a year later. It said that hikers had reported unexplained lights and human shapes near the closed trails. The note ended with a statement that access to the area was restricted indefinitely for safety reasons. I don't know if anyone's gone back there since. I haven't. Sometimes I still think about the smell that drifted through my tent that morning, and the faint footprints by the stream. I grew up in Washington, but I moved to Montana in my late 20s after getting a job as a backcountry trail guide. I didn't mind solitude. In fact, I liked it. There's something about the quiet of the mountains that strips away everything unnecessary. You learn to be patient, cautious, and aware. In late spring of 2017, I decided to take a solo trip through the Highwood Mountains, east of Great Falls. It wasn't part of my work, just a personal trip, a way to clear my head before the tourist season began. The area I picked was remote, but not unexplored. A network of old Forest Service trails winding through sharp ridges and deep valleys. One trail in particular, Miller Ridge, had always intrigued me. It was mostly forgotten now. A narrow path that split from the main route and climbed toward an old fire lookout that hadn't been used since the early 90s. I'd read about the ridge years earlier. The structure still stood, though it was falling apart. Hikers who'd been there said the view was incredible. You could see for miles over untouched forest, and on clear days, you could even make out the faint line of the Missouri River. It was a 2-day hike to reach it, so I packed light. Tent, minimal food, a small camp stove, my journal, and a GPS. I set out early in the morning, following the logging road until the terrain narrowed into a single trail. The first day went smoothly. The air was crisp, the forest floor damp from recent rain. I saw deer, grouse, and what looked like mountain lion tracks near the creek bed. Nothing unusual. By late afternoon, I reached the base of the ridge. It was steeper than I expected, with jagged switchbacks cutting upward through thick pines. I made camp on a small flat section just off the trail. I could see the outline of the ridge summit through the treetops, dark, sharp, and distant. That night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest drifted in: crickets, the rustle of wind through branches, the distant snap of falling pine cones. I remember thinking how untouched the place felt, as if nobody had walked this trail in decades. The next morning, I noticed something odd as I packed up camp. About 10 feet from where I'd pitched my tent were boot prints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, larger, heavier, pressed deep into the soil, as if someone had stood there for a while. The tracks led uphill for a few yards, then stopped abruptly, vanishing into the undergrowth. It wasn't impossible that another hiker had passed during the night, but it didn't make much sense. There were no fresh signs of movement on the trail below, and I hadn't heard a single sound besides natural ones. I told myself maybe it was an old track, softened by the rain and made to look fresh. I brushed it off and started hiking. The ridge trail was brutal. It zigzagged upward in long, uneven climbs. The air grew thinner, colder, and the trees gradually gave way to more open rock faces. By mid-afternoon, I reached the top. The old fire lookout stood crookedly on its foundation, a box-shaped skeleton of wood and rusted metal. The door was gone, and part of the roof had collapsed inward. I didn't go inside. It didn't look safe. I just set my pack down and took in the view. It was breathtaking. Miles of unbroken forest stretched in every direction. The wind up there was constant, sharp and dry. I stayed for about an hour before heading back down the trail a short distance to find a flat area to camp for the night. That evening, as I was heating water for coffee, I noticed movement near the tree line below. It was subtle, just a dark shape between trunks. At first, I thought it was a bear, but it wasn't moving like one. It was upright. I froze, watching, but after a few seconds, the shape seemed to blend back into the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe my eyes catching shadows as the sun dipped. I finished my coffee, forced myself to relax, and went to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. There was no sound, no breeze, just stillness. Then I noticed a faint crunch of soil, slow and deliberate, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I held my breath, every muscle tight. The steps came closer, then stopped. Minutes passed, though it felt longer. I didn't move. Eventually, the sound faded away into the distance. I waited until dawn before unzipping the tent. Outside, the ground was disturbed again. Fresh prints, the same kind I'd seen before. They circled the tent once, then headed back toward the ridge. I felt uneasy, but convinced myself it had to be another hiker, or maybe a hunter camping nearby. Still, I packed early and started descending. I hadn't planned to leave so soon, but something in my gut told me not to linger. The forest was silent that morning, unnaturally so. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. Halfway down the ridge, I stopped to rest near a small clearing. That's when I noticed the footprints again. Not just one set this time, but several. They trailed along the same path I was taking, weaving in and out of sight. Some looked fresher than others, as if whoever made them was following at intervals. I started walking faster, glancing over my shoulder more than once. Each time, the woods looked exactly the same. Endless pine trunks, soft green light, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By late afternoon, I reached the lower slope where I'd camped the first night. My original fire ring was still there, though scattered. Around it, the soil was marked again, prints overlapping prints, too many to count, some deeper, as if whatever made them had stood there for a long time. I didn't stop. I kept moving until the forest began to thin and the logging road came into view. My truck was parked about a mile further down, but as I walked, something about the trees on either side felt wrong. They looked older somehow, darker, as though I'd stepped into a part of the forest that hadn't seen light in years. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank. No signal, no coordinates, just a frozen map. That's when I realized the forest had gone silent again. It's difficult to describe what silence like that feels like until you've heard it. It isn't peace, it's absence. It's as if every living thing has gone still for a reason. Then I saw movement again. Not close, but far ahead. Something crossing the road. It was tall, too tall to be a person, but not broad enough for a bear. It crossed smoothly, not hurried, as if it knew I was watching. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, then forced myself to keep walking. By the time I reached my truck, daylight was fading. My nerves were shot. I got inside, started the engine, and looked in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the trees, standing still, facing my direction. I blinked, and it was gone. I drove the entire way back to Great Falls without stopping. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of what I had experienced. I looked up recent hiker reports from the highwoods. Nothing unusual. No missing persons, no sightings, no warnings about wildlife. A week later, I decided to clean my boots before storing my gear. That's when I noticed something on the soles, fine, dry soil, but mixed with something darker, almost ashy. I recognized it immediately. It was the same dark soil from Miller Ridge. The prints I'd seen weren't ordinary. The longer I thought about them, the more I realized they weren't even shaped quite right. The heels were too deep, and the toes too long, spread unnaturally far apart, as if whoever made them had walked barefoot, but heavier than a human should. Months later, while guiding a group on a different trail system, one of my clients mentioned something strange. He'd been hiking near the highwoods a few weeks prior, and had seen what he thought was a person standing motionless on a ridge far above him. He said it didn't move the entire time he watched, not even when the wind shifted. When he told me the ridge's name, I felt my stomach turn. Miller Ridge. He said he hadn't seen it again after that day. I didn't say anything to him, just nodded and changed the subject. But even now, years later, I still think about those footprints circling my tent. I think about the silence that would fall just before something moved. I've spent a lot of my adult life outdoors, but Greywater Swamp was unlike anywhere I'd ever been. I went there in late August of 2014. At that time, I was working for a small environmental survey company out of southern Georgia. We were contracted by state authorities to collect samples from wetlands that were being reclaimed for conservation. Greywater Swamp was one of those areas. My partner on that trip was a guy named Evan. We'd worked together for almost 2 years, and both of us were used to long field days in uncomfortable terrain. We were assigned to spend 3 nights out there to map water flow and take soil readings. It sounded simple enough. Greywater wasn't easy to reach. We had to drive through an hour of dirt roads, then haul our gear in by canoe through a narrow channel that led deep into the swamp. The water was dark, and the air smelled sour, a mix of decay and salt. Spanish moss hung in heavy curtains over the cypress trees. The sound of frogs and insects was constant. We set up camp on a slightly elevated area where the ground was firm enough to pitch tents. The first day went smoothly. We collected readings, took photographs, and marked coordinates. It was slow work, but uneventful. That night, though, something felt off. The swamp doesn't go silent even at night, but I remember waking up sometime after midnight and realizing it was completely quiet. Just still air, thick with moisture. I tried to go back to sleep, but couldn't shake the unease that something was nearby. In the morning, I chalked it up to nerves and didn't mention it. We went deeper into the swamp that day, several miles beyond our first camp, following a network of old drainage channels. Around mid-afternoon, we came across an area where the ground rose higher than usual. The moss was thicker too, hanging in clumps that almost reached the water. That was when I first saw it. At the edge of the trees, partially hidden behind a wall of moss, was a shape. Not quite human, but upright. I thought it was just a trick of shadow, but then it moved. I froze for several seconds before convincing myself it was an illusion. Maybe a tree trunk shifting with the wind. But the air was still that afternoon, completely motionless. We moved on and didn't talk about it. But the longer we worked, the stronger the feeling became that something was near us. That night, the quiet came back, It was even worse than before. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement, faint sloshing water, not far from camp. I sat up and listened. It wasn't an animal. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate. The next morning, I checked the area around the tents. There were marks in the mud that didn't make sense. Not footprints exactly, but wide impressions, as if something had stood there pressing down with enormous weight. The third day, we'd moved deeper into the swamp, following a faint animal path through knee-high water. The smell of rot was stronger than before. Insects swarmed thick around our faces, and the sound of them was constant. After about 2 hours, we found a clearing surrounded by trees that leaned inward unnaturally, their roots exposed like claws gripping the soil. The water there was shallow but perfectly still. As I was taking a soil sample, I noticed something at the far end of the clearing, a mound rising slightly out of the water. It looked almost like an old tree stump at first, until I realized it was shaped wrong. It had a curve like a shoulder. Then, just as I was staring at it, it sank slowly, vanishing beneath the surface. There was no splash, no ripple, just gone. I don't remember much of what I said to myself in that moment, only the cold clarity that washed through me. We turned back early that afternoon. I kept catching glimpses of movement through the hanging moss, slow, shifting figures that blended perfectly into the swamp. Every time I looked directly, there was nothing there, but out of the corner of my eye, the shadows seemed to breathe. When we reached camp, I realized our equipment had been disturbed. The cases were moved, the sample bags scattered. The tent flap was unzipped even though we'd both closed it. Nothing was taken, but everything had been touched. That night, I barely slept. Every hour, I woke to sounds, soft dragging noises, faint splashes, the brittle snapping of branches somewhere just beyond the firelight. At dawn, the air was cold and heavy. Fog clung low over the water. We decided to leave early and head back to the canoes. The trail was almost gone, swallowed by mist. The deeper we went, the more wrong the forest felt. I remember turning to check behind us and catching a clear glimpse of something standing in the fog, tall, covered in hanging moss, motionless. Its shape was barely visible, but it was facing us. I didn't stop again after that. We pushed through knee-deep water until we reached the edge of the swamp and found the canoe. I didn't look back, but as we paddled away, I kept feeling that the fog behind us wasn't empty. When we finally reached the road, the sky was clear and bright again, as if the swamp had never existed. I filed my field report a few days later, omitting most of what I'd seen. I just wrote that conditions were unsafe, and that the site wasn't viable for extended survey work. Months passed before I read anything about gray water again. In early 2015, a local paper ran a small article about a missing hunter. His boat had been found near the same inlet we used to enter the swamp. Search teams never recovered a body, only his gear, scattered along the bank, half buried in mud. One of the deputies who spoke to the reporter described the area as impossible to search because the ground kept shifting underfoot. He also mentioned something about large impressions near the water's edge, not human, but upright and wide, as if something heavy had stood there watching. That detail froze me when I read it. You've made it to the end, but remember, the story doesn't always end when the video does. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll meet again. Until then, take care.